the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties, and we've got Deputy Chairperson Andrew Ecclestone presenting to us live from Select Committee 4.
Kia ora, Chair. I can just say it's the oddest Select Committee submission I've ever done because there's no MPs present.
Yeah, sorry about the timing.
And actually that raises a question I wanted to ask you, because in watching the submissions over the last couple of days, I have not heard any questions from any New Zealand First members. And I wanted to ask if New Zealand First members have been present during committee sessions on a bill that they are committed to passing.
You can just carry on with your submission for now if you like.
Right. If they've not been present, I think that's quite shocking, because they're committed to passing a bill, and the bill does violence to our constitution and lawmaking, and this absence is doing damage to our democracy. We trust that members of the committee have read our written submission, so I will not spend much time recapping that. In brief, the Council opposes the bill and does not believe it should pass. The bill's definition of liberties in Clause 8 is deeply flawed. The bill elevates property rights above other human rights, and this is at the core of its danger to our country. And the Regulatory Standards Board is a nexus for corruption. While I've listened to many of the oral submissions made on the bill yesterday and today, I've not heard them all. But amongst the submissions I did hear, one serious issue that was not mentioned is something the Council wants to bring to the committee's attention. Two agencies the Council is not often likely to promote the concerns of are the Security Intelligence Service and the Government Communications Security Bureau. We are doing so today because their concerns about this bill echo ours in two ways. First, the way the bill's narrow principles and certifying process will chill policy options that do not align with the principles. And second, the risks created by the Regulatory Standards Board. The intelligence agency's concerns were set out in emails and briefings to their Minister Judith Collins that were disclosed under the OIA and reported in the Post last Wednesday. First, in relation to how the Clause 8 principles create risk. The Clause 8 principles and the requirements for justifying departure from them will chill free and frank advice on policy options where it is easy to show the costs but hard to quantify the benefits. National and New Zealand First MPs are going to want to consider what the intelligence agencies told their minister on 24th of March this year. They advised her, and I quote, "The proposed principles and focus of the bill are not suited to recognise the need for legislation with a national security purpose or incorporating national security elements. Under the proposed construct, it will be challenging to quantify the benefits of national security related elements in order to compare them to more easily quantifiable financial costs. This may make it more challenging to ensure that appropriate consideration is given to national security issues in the development and review of regulation. The agencies consider that a focus on whether regulatory systems are able to achieve their intended purpose would be more appropriate. While the bill proposes a mechanism whereby responsible chief executives would be able to explain where a proposed bill or existing legislation is inconsistent with the principles, this would likely make it more challenging to justify regulation that sought to achieve outcomes such as national security that is not easily quantifiable. Let me make that very clear for members. The GCSB and SIS have said to ministers that this bill is a risk to national security. Do National and New Zealand First MPs want to put New Zealand's national security at risk? Do they want to see policy and legal proposals quashed in the early stages because of the chilling effect of Clause 8 and Clause 9? The intelligence agencies provided a practical example of the risks the bill creates, saying it has significant implications across the public service and has the potential to cause, quote, delays to improvements to other national security legislation as the resourcing of other agencies, for example, DPMC or the Ministry of Justice, may be prioritised to meet the expectations of the bill at the expense of other legislative work programmes. For example, the Ministry of Justice has just begun its review of the Terrorism Suppression Act, which could be deprioritised in response to the proposals. The second area where the GCSB and SIS raise concerns that happen to align with the Council's is in relation to the Regulatory Standards Board. In the concluding paragraph of our written submission, the Council said that the proposed Regulatory Standards Board is a glaring nexus for corruption and lobbying by vested interests. The committee heard yesterday from Professor Boyd Swinburne of Health Coalition Aotearoa about tobacco multinationals trying to block regulation in Australia. One of the biggest threats to good policy making is the capture or swaying of policy development by people or organisations who work to ensure that they or their clients' interests are prioritised in policy and legislative design over and above the interests of the environment or the welfare of people. large companies with significant resources are more likely to be successful in these efforts to influence lawmaking than the country's small and medium enterprises, let alone small NGOs or community groups. As we've seen from Radio New Zealand reporting about the cosy relations between the alcohol industry and a manager in the Ministry of Health, these lobbying efforts are often successful in corrupting policymaking that should be reducing harm and improving health. In creating the Regulatory Standards Board, the bill sets up another massive target for big corporates to lobby for regulation that benefits them or for removing regulation they do not like. It's also an incentive for corruption in the form of donations to political parties in return for a place on the board, or for a particular piece of regulation to be recommended by the board to be scrapped or not approved. In their March 2025 briefing to Minister Collins, the SIS and GCSB said this about the Regulatory Standards Board. Given the proposed role of the Regulatory Standards Board, we consider there would be value in national security screening of members to ensure that they are not susceptible to foreign interference. This is particularly relevant as foreign states are likely to have a strong interest in how New Zealand's regulatory environment seeks to manage national security threats. In other words, the intelligence agencies have identified the board as being a target for capture by foreign interests. The agencies are saying that the board too is a risk to New Zealand's national security. Will National and New Zealand First MPs be relaxed when foreign companies, which would not be classed as a foreign power under the Crimes Countering Foreign Interference Bill currently in front of the House, interfere with our regulatory processes? In short, the NZSIS and GCSB have said this bill is a risk to New Zealand's national security. The Council agrees with their analysis. This bill is a risk to New Zealand's security as a nation. As such, voting for this bill in its current form, particularly with the Regulatory Standards Board, is frankly unpatriotic. National and New Zealand First members may bridle at being called unpatriotic, but they will have to wear that label if this bill goes through as it stands. Two of the agencies that governments and the public rely upon to keep them safe has said it is a risk to national security. Countless other agents, including the Ministry of Regulation itself and the Treasury, have said the bill will do harm to the country's policy and lawmaking. What is unpatriotic, if not passing legislation that will do harm to the country? In conclusion, this bill does violence to our constitution and norms of lawmaking. If passed in its present form, it will do violence to policymaking and regulating. It will enable harm to people and to the environment and to society. It is dangerous to our country and to our democracy. It is an unpatriotic bill that is a risk to national security, according to our intelligence agencies. If National and New Zealand First MPs do not have the courage to walk away from their coalition agreement on this bill, they should weaken this bill substantially. And while we oppose the bill in full, we have some recommendations for amendments. First of all, you should remove the Regulatory Standards Board entirely by deleting clauses 28 to 40 in Schedule 2. You should insert into Clause 5, the interpretation clause, a definition of person that states for the purposes of this Act, a person means only a natural person and not a legal person. This will mean the principles of liberties in Clause 8b only apply to human beings and not companies. The Clause 8 principles should be revised heavily with a balanced framework that refers to meeting international human rights obligations while developing regulation in an open manner that requires public participation in its early stages, so that it produces regulation that is effective, proportionate, transparent, accountable, adaptable, and treaty consistent. Finally, we think that if you really want to strengthen the way that agencies conduct regulatory stewardship, the way to do it is by amending Section 12(1) of the Public Service Act 2020 so that the duty on public service chief executives to steward the legislation administered by the department requires a published programme of open and participatory review of that legislation and publication of the estimated cost of undertaking these reviews. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. We'll go to Cameron Luxton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Andrew, for your submission. I was particularly interested in the part about the appointment to the board. Do you think that the same risk applies for foreign actors having influence over board appointments to the way the RBNZ board is appointed? And following on from that, the Monetary Policy Committee?
Yes, I think that New Zealand's public appointment system is rife for foreign interference because so much of it is in the hands of Cabinet's Appointment and Honours Committee and not handled by an independent body that would appoint people on merit. it's entirely likely that people are appointed to public offices in this country on the basis of lobbying and donations.
So you're, just to be clear, you're saying the risk for appointments that you've made in the submission goes beyond just this bill and this regulatory board.
Yes, I think we have in New Zealand extremely weak standards for ensuring the integrity of appointments to these kinds of positions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tēnā koutou. Ko putoa ki te maunga, ko rangitai ki te awa ko ngā tiawa te iwi, ko ngā mai hi te hapu tū te ao, tū te pō. My name is Tanya Waikato. The Regulatory Standards Bill is an affront to the constitutional foundations of Aotearoa. It is a cowardly, covert attack on Te Tiriti o Waitangi that desecrates the partnership between Māori and the Crown. The bill is a blatant and audacious attempt by the ACT Party and its foreign sponsors to subvert our democratic processes for their own private gain and constitutionally entrench their far-right political views into the very fabric of our society. Regulatory Standards Bill will create a new regulatory constitution that will impact every facet of our laws, our society, and our country as a whole. The influence and control that it will give to the ACT Party and Minister Seymour is dangerous, undemocratic, and unjustified. Te Tiriti is under attack yet again, less than 6 months after the Treaty Principles Bill was banished from this House. It is an abuse of the legislative process to allow these continued and ongoing attacks on Te Tiriti and on our democracy. The Regulatory Standards Bill is an attempted legislative coup and a power grab by a party who garnered a mere 8% of the vote. The bill represents a serious threat to our democratic system through the deliberate concentration of power in a single minister, a non-elected board, and a ministry who will hold an unreasonable level of power over all other ministries. The information gathering powers provided in the bill are unjustified, go well beyond the scope of the policy problem identified, and raise significant red flags about the introduction of fascism to this country. The Regulatory Standards Bill seeks to implement a profound, far-reaching constitutional transformation with respect to Te Tiriti under the guise of improving lawmaking and reducing unnecessary legislation. The supreme irony is that the bill itself was assessed as being unnecessary legislation by the Ministry for Regulation itself. The Minister has provided no explanation for why he is ignoring his own ministry's advice and proceeding with this bill that seeks to make him the most powerful politician in this country. I was counsel for the urgent Waitangi Tribunal claim into the Regulatory Standards Bill on behalf of Toitu Te Tiriti. In summary, the key findings of the Waitangi Tribunal's urgent inquiry were that, firstly, the Regulatory Standards Bill is of constitutional significance. If the bill is enacted without meaningful consultation with Māori, it will constitute a breach of the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, specifically the principles of partnership and active protection. Secondly, there was no targeted consultation with Māori on the Regulatory Standards Bill, a point that was accepted by the Crown. As a result of that failure, the consultation process by the Crown for the bill was fundamentally flawed. Finally, the Crown must immediately halt the advancement of the Regulatory Standards Bill to allow for meaningful engagement with Māori and the dialogue envisioned by the treaty partnership. We do not think the bill should progress in its current form. The final point I have to make is about the escalating security risks surrounding this bill as a result of the Deputy Prime Minister's actions. Last week, myself and 2 of our female expert witnesses had our addresses published by right-wing extremists inciting hatred and violence against us because of our opposition to this bill. I had to have a security escort to come here today to present this submission. Let that sink in. A security escort to give an oral submission on a bill that falsely claims to be about improving legislation. These right-wing extremists have followed the lead of the Minister for Regulation, David Seymour, who who has published photos of other academics online who have been critical of this bill, including Dame Anne Salmon and Dr. George Laking. And in doing so, the Minister has given implicit support to the actions of these extremists to target experts and others who are speaking out against this bill. So the question I have for the members of this committee who are supporting this bill is simple. Is this truly the kind of democracy that you want? One where academics and lawyers are having their personal safety threatened for opposing a bill, where the Deputy Prime Minister uses taxpayer dollars to fund online campaigns that lead to the inciting of hatred and violence. Is that your vision for New Zealand? Because if it is not, you need to take a good, hard look in the mirror and decide what side of history you want to be standing on when it comes time to vote for this bill at the second reading. This is not a game. Our democracy is being eroded further and further by the second, and if you continue to support this bill through to enactment, each and every one of you will be complicit in the introduction of fascism that underlies this bill. So I implore this committee to act in the best interests of all New Zealanders and stop this rot before it is too late. For the sake of our country, our children and our grandchildren, the Regulatory Standards Bill must be wholly and utterly rejected. Thank you.
Where we've got the New Zealand Federation of Multicultural Council, presented by Pancha Narayanan. Welcome.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, we have you for 10 minutes, but of course, if you leave some time at the end, we can ask questions.
Thank you. Am I sitting in the right place and can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Pancha Narayanan, very privileged to be invited to share our views. First and foremost, apologies for being late. Lost my way to get to this place, and it's
Easily done.
Ominous that it's the same way that we felt about the bill as well. 750,000 people that we have a reach to. Very often we do not have any problem communicating. On this occasion, we were not able to share what this bill was about because it was so long-winded and somewhat complex. After reading it a little bit with some appreciation, we felt that to go through this bill to defend it needed a lot of legal knowledge and perhaps academics as well, too complex for communities. On the surface of it, it appeared as if it was trying to bring consistency across legislation and regulation, which would have got a tick. But underneath it, we observed serious omissions, neglect. The thing is that if we are trying to achieve consistency across all legislation, maybe the question that needs to be asked as well is that how do we apply the Treaty of Waitangi consistently across all legislation as well? This one sort of completely ignores it, and that worries us with all the work that people have done, the investment that New Zealand has done in the past, right? We find that this sort of negates, undo everything that we have done in the past to bring harmony in this country. And I think that is there. It protects property owners and at an individual level. We don't understand what that means and how that sits with the Treaty of Waitangi as well. So having had a conversation with all our regional councils, 25 multicultural councils around the country, from Whangarei all the way down to Invercargill, with good relationships with the government of the day and with Tangata Whenua, we feel that this bill is not ready to go forward. It could have been simpler, it could have been more meaningful, and it could have been more inclusive.
Thanks for the opportunity to submit. I'm a senior lecturer at Vic Law School, and in fact, coming down from teaching my first class in statutory interpretation just this morning to kick off the new semester. This is sort of my bread and butter, how to legislate, how to interpret legislation, legislative quality. So what I want to do in my submission is, I hope, be helpful to the committee in recommending some changes that I think will improve the bill. So in general, one of the absolute basic principles of legislation, and this is both in the LDAC legislation guidelines and in Clause 8 in the Bill's principles itself, is that you only legislate if you need to. You shouldn't interfere in people's lives. You shouldn't create the costs of legislation unless it is necessary. And official advice from the Ministry for Regulation is that legislation is not necessary here. The regulatory impact statement and the cabinet paper both say that officials do not think that legislation is needed, and I agree. What that means is that the bill should not be passed. That would be my first recommendation to the committee. To quote Chapter 1 of the LDAC guidelines, legislation should be fit for purpose. It should be used only when necessary, but when it is used, it should be effective for that purpose, including minimising unintended costs. So I don't think this should pass, but if the committee is minded to recommend to the House that it pass, there are several changes that, in my view, could be made to ensure that it is more effective for its purpose and minimises unintended costs. Some significant amendments are required.
Eddie, I take it that you agree with the LDAC guidelines, and you've also referred to the Legislation Act there, and not all of the Legislation Act is in force, and I think that some of it will be repealed. What do you think about that?
So Part 4 of the Legislation Act has never come into force. I think it comes into force automatically in about 6 years afterwards, so I think in about 2 years' time. And that gives some statutory backbone to the disclosure statement requirements. That's what officials at the Ministry for Regulation recommended happen, that be brought into force. And I can see a bill. There is, I think, an opportunity here to write a bill that focuses in a sort of Auditor General Ombudsman way on regulatory quality. The bill as currently written just is not that bill. Pulling together some stuff from the Legislation Act, pulling together some stuff from the Public Service Act, or changing the name of this to the Regulatory Standards Legislation Bill and making some tweaks to those individual statutes rather than a standalone could be helpful. But the vast majority of what's currently drafted in the bill is, in my view, not.